The rope burned through her palms before she had a chance to cry out. Colette Tanner hit the barn floor hard, one knee cracking against the packed earth, the air punching from her lungs in a single brutal exhale. Above her, the hay pulley she had rigged 3 days ago after the storm took the original gave way entirely, sending 60 pounds of feed sack crashing down 2 feet from her head. Dust billowed. The horses screamed in their stalls. She was on her feet in 4 seconds. Counted them. 4. That was all she allowed herself before her spine straightened and her jaw locked and she reached for the fallen sack with bleeding hands like nothing had happened at all. "Don't." The voice came from the barn doorway. Low, certain. The kind of voice that did not ask questions while it was giving commands. Colette did not turn around. "You are trespassing on Tanner land and I am busy." "You are bleeding on Tanner land," Lucas Greer said, "and that pulley is going to kill you the next time you try it." She turned then, because ignoring a man who had just watched her nearly die felt somehow more embarrassing than facing him. He was standing in the frame of the barn door with morning light cutting hard around his shoulders, hat in his hands, and his expression was doing something she despised almost immediately. It was not pity. She could have dismissed pity. It was something quieter and more dangerous than pity. It was the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had already understood something about her that she had not wanted understood. "I have managed this ranch for 14 months without assistance," she said, keeping her voice flat. "I will manage it for 14 more." "You have managed it alone," he said, moving into the barn now without invitation, setting his hat on a post. "That is not the same thing as managing it well." She felt heat climb her throat. "Get out." He crouched beside the broken pulley without looking at her, examined the frayed rope with the unhurried competence of a man who fixed things not for recognition, but because things needed fixing. Whoever strung this the first time used dry rot hemp. Should have been replaced 2 seasons back. "I know that. Then you also know it would have come down again inside of a week no matter how careful you were." She opened her mouth, closed it. Her palms were stinging now with a persistence she could no longer fully ignore, and the humiliation of that small physical betrayal was somehow worse than the fall itself. 14 months of fighting this ranch into submission with nothing but her own 2 hands and the sheer, grinding refusal to ask anyone for anything. And here stood Lucas Greer seeing through every inch of it in under 2 minutes. She had no idea yet that she was already in love with him. She would spend another 2 months resisting it. 14 months earlier, Colette Tanner had arrived in Calvert Creek, Texas, on the 2nd Tuesday of September, 1882, aboard a freight wagon because the stage line did not run that far west. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and she possessed $17, a leather trunk containing 3 dresses and her mother's Bible, a bill of sale for 340 acres of drought-stressed rangeland, and a grief so enormous and so freshly cut that she kept it entirely behind her eyes where no one could see it. Her father, Hector Tanner, had died in April. He had not died gently. He had died in debt, in a boarding house in San Antonio, owing money to 4 different men and a bank, and the ranch outside Calvert Creek that he had purchased on speculation in 1878 and never properly worked had passed to Colette by the terms of his will because she was the only Tanner left. She had 2 weeks to decide whether to sell it at whatever price the land buyers in town would offer her, or to go and see it herself. She went herself. That had always been her nature. What she found was not encouraging. The farmhouse was a 2-room structure that had been built with reasonable intention and then abandoned to the elements for 4 years. The barn roof had a hole in it the size of a buckboard. The well was good, which she counted as a mercy. The land itself was harder to read. She walked every acre of it in the first week, morning to evening, learning its gullies and its rises, and somewhere in the middle of the third day, she stood on the low ridge at the property's northern edge and looked south across the grass, and the scatter of live oaks and something old and stubborn in her chest said, "No. You are not selling this." She did not sell it. She sent 2 letters. One to the bank that held the deed, arranging a payment schedule that required her to generate income within 6 months or lose the property. One to a livestock broker in Austin, inquiring about cattle prices. Then she rolled up her sleeves, metaphorically and then literally, and she started working. Calvert Creek was a town of approximately 400 people, a hardware store, 2 saloons, a general mercantile, a church, a one-room schoolhouse, and a sheriff who wore his badge like he had won it in a card game. It was the kind of town that noticed strangers and then filed them into a category and stopped noticing them, which suited Colette perfectly. What did not suit her was the way people in Calvert Creek treated a woman running land alone. The hardware store owner, a man named Pritchard, had a habit of asking her if she was sure about every purchase she made, the kind of asking that was not helpfulness but the slow leak of disbelief. The other ranchers in the area, mostly men, treated her with a mixture of mild curiosity and the benevolent condescension that she had come to recognize as the most exhausting thing about being a woman who was trying to do something. They did not think she would fail. Failure was too active. They thought she would simply give up, the way they assumed women gave things up, quietly and eventually, when the difficulty became too apparent. She was not going to give up. She hired one hand in those early months, a weathered older man named Earl Hobbs, who had been working the ranges around Calvert Creek since before it had a name. Earl was 63 and had bad knees and was the single most useful person she met in her first year, and he treated her with the specific, uncomplicated respect of a man who judged people by whether they showed up on time and did the work. She showed up on time. She did the work. By December of 1881, she had 11 head of cattle and a plan. By March of 1882, she had 23 head, 2 mended fences, a new door on the farmhouse, and a knowledge of the land's water sources that she had earned 1 boot-soaking creek crossing at a time. She had also developed the habit of doing everything herself, or as close to everything as Earl's aging joints would allow, because she could not afford to hire more help, and because accepting help from neighbors felt like handing them a proof that they had been right about her all along. This was the trap she had built for herself, though she would not have called it that. She would have called it independence. She would have called it necessity. She would have called it pride if she had been in a charitable mood about her own nature, which she generally was not. Lucas Greer had his ranch, the Greer Spread, 3 miles north of the Tanner property, separated by a creek and a long stand of cedar. He was 31 years old, which she would not learn for some time, and he had owned his land for 6 years, having bought it at 25 with money he had earned driving cattle up from South Texas, and money he had saved with the focused economy of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and was willing to sacrifice everything else to get there. He was not remarkable looking in the way of men who knew. They were not remarkable looking and compensated for it. He was broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who worked hard with his body, and he had dark hair that needed cutting more often than he cut it, and his eyes were a specific gray-green that changed depending on the light in a way that she refused to notice for several weeks after their first proper meeting. He had 2 full-time ranch hands, brothers named Damon and Pete Culliver, and he ran a tight, prosperous operation that had earned him the quiet, understated regard of the area ranchers. He had also, it turned out, been watching the Tanner property for months before he walked into her barn that October morning, not watching in any sinister sense. Watching the way a neighbor watches when a neighbor is alone, and the work is clearly too much for one person, and the pride in the situation is written in every tight-shouldered, never asking movement of the person in question. He had seen her on the ridge line twice and not approached. He had seen her hauling fence posts at the property's south edge and driven past without stopping because something in her posture made it plain that stopping would not be welcome. He had stopped anyway, that October morning, because the sound of the crash had reached the road, and there are things that override the calculation of welcome. So there they stood in her barn, with her bleeding hands and his unhurried examination of the broken pulley, and the air between them carrying the specific charge of two people who have not yet admitted anything to each other. "I will fix it," she said finally. It was as close to a concession as she was capable of in that moment. "I know you will," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, without the hesitation of doubt, without the warmth of surprise, just a flat certainty, that disarmed her more than anything else could have. He looked up at her from where he was crouched. "But I will fix it today, if that is agreeable." Why, he considered that. Because I have the rope in my wagon and it is the right kind and I was going this way anyway. It was a lie, or at least it was not the whole truth, but it was a gracious one. He had driven out of his way. She would learn this later and it would sit in her chest for 3 days before she allowed herself to feel anything about it. "Fine," she said. "I have things to attend to." "I expect you do." She left him in the barn and went to the house to wrap her hands and pretend she had not been watching from the window in the way that she was absolutely watching from the window. He worked without hurry and without performance, replacing the pulley hardware and stringing new rope with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of task 1,000 times. He did not call her back to show her what he had done. He simply did it, reloaded his wagon, and drove out without knocking on her door, which was somehow the most significant thing he could have done, and she spent the rest of the day being irritated about it. He came back 4 days later with a question about a fence line that she would understand later was not genuinely a question about a fence line. He had his hat in his hands again. She noticed that he always held his hat when he came to her door, a gesture so old-fashioned and deliberate that it made her feel something she was not ready to name. "The survey marker on the northwest corner," he said. "I want to make sure we agree on where the property line runs before I extend my north fence in the spring." "We agree," she said, not inviting him in. "Have you walked it recently, in the spring?" "There has been significant soil erosion along the creek bank since the spring." The markers may have shifted. She studied him. He met her eyes with the equanimity of a man who was comfortable being studied. "Are you saying you think I do not know where my own property line is?" "I am saying the creek moved," he said simply. "It does that." She walked the property line with him that afternoon because he was, in the maddeningly factual way of him, correct about the creek. They walked 600 yards of the boundary in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself notable. She was not accustomed to silences that did not feel like negotiations. The afternoon light was long and gold across the grass, and the creek was running low from the dry summer, and she pointed to the marker stone when they found it and said, "There. Exactly where the deed says." "Good," he said. He did not say, "You were right," which she would have resented. He said good, which closed the topic and left no ledger between them. They stood for a moment at the creek. A pair of scissor-tailed flycatchers worked the air above the water in their elegant, impractical way. "How long have you been at it on your own?" he asked, and the question was so quiet that it did not have the shape of an intrusion. "Since April of last year," she said before she had decided to answer. 14 months. That is a long time to work 340 acres alone. Earl helps. Earl's knees keep him off a horse 3 days a week. She looked at him sharply. He shrugged. Calvert Creek is a small town. People talk about each other's knees. Despite herself, she felt the corner of her mouth attempt something. She denied it. "I manage," she said. "I know you do," he said again, in that same flat, undecorated certainty. It happened again, the thing where it disarmed her when she was braced for doubt. She walked back to her house, and he walked back to where he had hitched his horse, and she told herself she would not think about him. And she thought about him for most of that evening while she mended a harness by lamplight and pretended she was not doing it. November arrived with a cold front that swept down from the panhandle and turned the dry rangeland brittle and difficult. Colette lost a calf to exposure the first week and spent 2 days angry at herself about it, going over every decision she had made regarding the cattle's shelter with the punishing precision of a woman who took her failures personally. Earl's knees got worse in the cold. She was genuinely on her own for the larger part of the month, riding fence in temperatures that made her fingers ache inside her gloves, hauling water when the North Trough froze, managing 28 head of increasingly ornery cattle who had opinions about the weather that they expressed physically. She did not ask for help. She would not have said she was too proud. She would have said she did not have the time to explain to anyone else what she needed or to supervise someone else's work, and both of those things were partially true, and the rest of it was what it was. Lucas Greer showed up on a Wednesday morning when the temperature had not gotten above 40 since Monday, and she was in the middle of an argument with a fence post that had heaved out of the frozen ground overnight, leaving a gap the cattle were immediately, enthusiastically discovering. He rode up on his gray horse and she heard him coming and did not look up. "Frost heave," he said. "I am aware. You need to drive it deeper and pack the base with gravel so the water does not get under it. I know how to set a fence post, Mr. Greer." "Lucas," he said. She straightened. He was watching her from horseback with that expression again, the careful, unhurried one. He had brought a second horse, she noticed, an extra mount fitted out with saddlebags. "I am riding my south fence line today," he said. "Your south fence and my south fence are the same fence in several places." "That is not accurate. The survey shows a 12-foot easement between, which has been informally consolidated into a shared fence by the last 3 owners of your property," he said. "It is one fence, in practice." He swung down from the gray. "I will work from the east. If you are working from the west, we will meet in the middle and it will take half the time." She stared at him. "You are very comfortable making decisions about my property." "I am proposing a practical arrangement," he said. "You can tell me to leave and I will leave." The wind came across the flat with a cutting intent, and she pulled her coat collar up and thought about the 32 fence posts she had counted that needed attention along that south line. "Start from the east," she said. He nodded and unloaded the saddlebags and got to work without further conversation, walking his horse along the fence line toward the eastern boundary while she turned back to the post she had been fighting. She worked. He worked. The morning moved over them in its cold, bright way. They met at a spot roughly in the middle of the south fence line at 1:45, and both of them stood looking at a section of wire that had been so completely destroyed by some animal pushing through it that it was going to require new wire and new staples and possibly a new post. "Steer," Lucas said, examining the damage. "A big one, probably one of yours, the mud on this side of the break." She looked at the hoofprints. He was right. "Damnation," she said quietly, meaning it. "I have wire," he said. "Of course you do. I also have coffee in a canteen and it is cold." She looked at him. He was not trying to charm her. He was stating facts about wire and coffee in the same tone. That was the thing about him that kept catching her sideways, the utter absence of performance. He was not trying to appear capable or generous or impressive. He simply was those things and saw no reason to announce it. "Thank you," she said, and the two words cost her more than he would know. They fixed the fence together. He poured her coffee from the canteen, and she held it in both hands and let the warmth work into her fingers while he pulled wire, and she held tension on the new section. And they worked in a rhythm that felt earned despite the fact that they had barely spent 4 hours in each other's company total. "Where did you come from?" she asked at one point, "before Calvert Creek, East Texas originally, then cattle trails north, then here." He drove a staple with 3 efficient strikes. "You, San Antonio. Before that, Fort Worth." She paused. "My father moved us a great deal." "Was he a rancher?" "He was a man with plans," she said carefully. "The plans were not always successful." Lucas was quiet for a moment, working. "Mine worked himself to death on other men's land," he said. "Never owned a foot of it. I decided young that was not going to be my story." Something in her recognized that. The decision made young, the shape of a whole life bent around a refusal. She understood that kind of spine. She just had not expected to find it in someone else. "You built your place yourself?" she asked. "Mostly. Culliver Brothers helped with the barn." "Good men." He looked at her briefly. "Earl Hobbs used to work my range before his knees. He mentioned you," she said. "What did he say?" "That you were fair and not too talkative." High praise from Earl. "The highest," she agreed. They finished the fence section, and she poured the rest of the coffee between their 2 cups, the tin cups she had produced from her saddlebag, and they stood in the thin November sun and drank it. The cattle in the middle distance were calm now, clustered near the water trough in a patient bovine huddle. "Colette," she said. She was not sure why she said it. He had not asked again. He looked at her. "My name," she said, because apparently she needed to explain it. "You have been calling me Miss Tanner, and I am 26 years old." "Lucas," he said, as if he had not already said it once. "I know," she said. The winter moved forward in the way that West Texas winters moved forward, which was not gently. The cold came in waves, breaking briefly into false warmth, and then slamming back with a renewed commitment. Colette lost 2 more cattle in December, both from an illness that moved through part of the herd before she caught it, and the financial reality of those losses sat on her chest at night like a stone. She was not going to make her first payment to the bank with anything to spare. She was going to make it barely, with $17 left over, which in January in a hard winter was not enough margin to feel safe. She did not tell anyone this. She told Earl to take the week after Christmas with his sister in town, because his knees needed the rest, and she needed to not have anyone watching her work the numbers with the particular expression she got when the numbers were frightening. Lucas came by on December 23rd because one of his heifers had wandered onto Tanner land through a gap she had not yet found in the north fence, and he came to collect her and to offer to help find the gap. She was short on sleep and shorter on patience, and she was also, underneath both of those things, something she had been trying not to look at directly for 6 weeks. She found the gap before he did. She showed it to him. He fixed it from his side, and she watched and offered not to help because it was his fence and her side of the fence was fine, and he looked at her with those light-changing eyes and said, "You are allowed to help with a thing even when you are not obligated to." "I am aware," she said. "I am not sure you are," he said mildly, and drove the last staple. She stood in the cold with her hands in her coat pockets and felt something she had been quarantining very carefully begin to move around behind its barriers. "I am not easy to help," she said. She did not know where that came from either. He turned to look at her. The late afternoon sun was doing something to the light that she was not going to think about. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to be easy." "Then what are you asking?" He picked up the wire stretcher and hung it back on his saddle in the unhurried way he did everything. "Right now I am asking if you have eaten today," he said. She opened her mouth to say yes, and realized it was a lie and closed it. "I have a pot of chili at the house," he said. "Damon makes it and makes too much of it on purpose, so there is always extra. It is not charity. It is a neighbor sharing a meal. People will talk," she said. It was not the refusal she had meant it to be. It came out more like an observation. "People in Calvert Creek talk about knees," he said. "They will survive talking about chili." She went to his house for dinner on December 23, 1882, and she would remember it for the rest of her life. The Greer Ranch house was nothing remarkable on the outside. A solid stone and timber structure with a covered porch and oil lamps burning warm through the windows in the early dark. Inside it was clean and spare and smelled of wood smoke and the chili that had been simmering on the cast iron stove. And Damon Culliver, who turned out to be a broad-faced young man of 23 with a gap between his front teeth and a shy manner, ladled generous portions into deep pottery bowls, and then immediately found pressing business in the bunkhouse that required him and his brother to be entirely elsewhere. She and Lucas sat at the kitchen table with the chili and cornbread and a pot of coffee that was better than any she had made in months, and they talked. They talked longer than she had intended. They talked about cattle breeding and water rights, and the politics of the Texas legislature regarding land grants, which was a topic she had been following with more attention than most people would expect, because it directly affected her deed's security. He was familiar with the issue, had testified before the county land office himself about a surveying dispute 3 years back. She asked him questions, and he answered them without the condescension that men so often brought to conversations with women about land law, just straightforward information exchanged between two people who both knew things about a subject. Then somehow, she was not certain how the transition happened, they were talking about San Antonio, about the missions along the river in the evenings, about the sound of it, which she missed. And he told her about the cattle drive up from the nooses in 1876, the summer of it, the scale of the sky at night on the open range, and the way he had looked out across all that land and understood something about himself that he had not had words for before. "You wanted something of your own," she said. "Yes." He was looking at his coffee cup. "Not because I wanted to own things, because I wanted a place where what I built stayed built, where the work was real." She thought about her father, about all the plans that had evaporated, about the way she had spent her childhood packing things and unpacking them and learning not to leave anything behind because you would just have to leave it again. "I understand that," she said softly. He looked at her. Something had shifted in the room. The evening had gotten late without her noticing, and the stove had settled into its comfortable nighttime register of ticks and warmth. And Lucas Greer was looking at her across the table with his careful, unhurried attention, and the guard she kept with such discipline was doing something unaccountable. "You are going to be fine," he said, not a platitude, a statement of fact in the same tone he used for everything factual. "You do not know that," she said. "I know what I have watched you do for 6 months," he said, "and I know what the land looks like. And I know something about a person's quality of attention when they are working, and yours is exceptional." She felt heat climb her face, which was humiliating and also undeniable. "That is a peculiar compliment." "I give peculiar compliments," he said. "They are the honest kind." She rode home at 9 in the evening under a cold, clear sky that was absolutely full of stars, And she was not smiling because she was a composed and practical person. And she was completely smiling the entire way home. Christmas passed and January began its hard work, and she paid her bank payment with $17 to spare. And she stood outside the bank in Calvert Creek with the receipt in her hand and let herself feel something that was the closest thing to relief she had felt in 14 months. Then she folded the receipt into her coat pocket and walked to the General Mercantile to spend 4 of those $17 on supplies, and gave herself exactly until she reached the door to feel it before she put it away and started thinking about February. Lucas came by the following week with a practical reason that she now recognized as a transparent scaffolding for the actual reason, and she let him come in because she was not entirely a fool. He had information about a cattle sale coming up in February in Abilene, a larger market than she had access to from Calvert Creek, and the timing and prices made sense for her to consider driving 8 to 10 of her best-grown steers north for it. He had been planning to take cattle to the same sale. The Culliver brothers would be handling his herd. "I would be willing to trail your cattle with mine," he said. They were sitting at her kitchen table now, because she had put the coffee on before she quite decided to, and the habit of his company had apparently overridden her deliberation. The Cullivers can manage a larger herd, and the trail is the same either way. You would get the Abilene market price instead of what Haskell at the stockyards here will offer you. The difference in price per head was significant. She had already done the arithmetic twice while he was talking, which he had probably known she would do. "What do you want in return?" she asked. Not suspicious, exactly, just clear about the fact that arrangements had structures. He looked mildly surprised. "A fair price for the trail share, same as I would charge anyone. And the actual reason you are offering." He was quiet for a moment. The oil lamp between them threw warm shadows across his face. "Because you are my neighbor, and it is a sensible arrangement, and you are too determined to ever ask for it yourself." She looked at him steadily. "You see through me," she said, and it was not a question, and it was not entirely comfortable. "I am not trying to," he said. "You are not a mystery, Colette. You are just very determined to look like you do not need anything from anyone, and that is not a flaw, but it costs you sometimes." The accuracy of it landed the way accurate things land when you have been working hard not to know them. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. "My father needed things from everyone," she said quietly. "He needed loans and favors and second chances and goodwill and extensions on extensions, and it was never enough, and eventually there was nothing left." She looked up. "I decided a long time ago that I was not going to be someone who needs." Lucas was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not rush to fill it with something soft and dismissive. "That is an understandable thing to decide," he said finally. "But there is a distance between needing and accepting, between weakness and cooperation." "Easy to say when you are not the one people are waiting to see fail," she said. "True," he said. He did not argue with that, did not try to tell her that she was imagining it or exaggerating it. He knew the town the same way she knew it, from the inside, and he knew she was not imagining it. "But you are not failing, and you have not failed, and the people who expected you to are going to have to find something else to do with their expectations." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp moved in some small draft and threw the shadows differently. "Send 8 steers with your drive," she said, "and I want a full accounting of expenses and sale prices." "Of course," he said, "and I am paying the trail fee in advance, not on credit." "Of course," he said again. She put out her hand. He shook it. His hand was warm and calloused, and held hers for precisely the amount of time that a handshake required, and she was aware of every second of it. February came, and the cattle drive went north and came back with a sale receipt that was enough to fund the next 6 months properly, and still make her spring payment to the bank with genuine margin. She sat with that receipt for a long time. Then she wrote a very correct and business-like thank you note to Lucas Greer and sent it with Earl. And then she sat in her kitchen for 20 minutes fighting the feeling that the correct and business-like thank you note was possibly the most cowardly thing she had ever done. She rode to his place instead. He was at the corral when she arrived, working with a young horse that had a lot of opinions about being worked with. He saw her come into the yard and handed the lead rope to Pete Culliver and walked over, and his face did the thing she had noticed it did when she appeared unexpectedly. A brief and quickly controlled lighting, like sun off water. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said, standing beside her horse with the reins in her hand. "The note was sufficient," he said. "It was not," she said. He waited. "It was professional," she said, "and you have not been only professional with me, and I think you deserved better than that." Something shifted in his expression. She pushed forward before she lost the nerve. "You have fixed my pulley and walked my fence line and shared your Abilene connection and your neighbor's chili and approximately 30 cups of coffee's worth of conversation," she said. "And I have been treating all of it like a series of business transactions because it was safer than treating it like what it was." "What was it?" he asked carefully. Her heart was doing something unreasonable. "Friendship," she said, because she was still not quite ready for the fuller truth. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "it was that." "I am sorry I made it seem otherwise," she said. "You were protecting yourself," he said. "I was not offended." She let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like several months. "Good," she said. He gestured toward the house. "I have coffee." "Of course you do," she said, and followed him. Spring came to the Tanner Ranch in March, warm and promising, and with it came a kind of opening in Colette that she associated with the loosening of soil after frost. She was still working as hard as ever, harder in some ways because the spring brought its own demands, branding, vaccinations, the complicated arithmetic of which cattle to grow and which to sell. But something had changed in the texture of it. The isolation was different now. It had edges where before it had been total. Lucas came by twice a week with the kind of consistency that was not accidental, but was never stated. They fell into a rhythm of shared information. What was happening with grazing conditions to the north? What the rainfall looked like for the season? The slow and important conversations of two people who were working the same land in the same unpredictable climate. And between the information there were other things. Opinions about books, which she had in quantity and he had in quality. The kind of reader who did not read widely but read deeply, and had specific views about what he read. Memories, carefully offered and carefully received. Hers of San Antonio and Fort Worth and the constant motion of her childhood. His of East Texas and the long drives and the years of working toward something solid. He told her in April about a woman he had been close to, 7 years back, before Calvert Creek. Her name had been Margaret, and she had been the daughter of a ranching family near Waco, and they had understood each other in some ways and not at all in others. And she had eventually married a merchant from Austin, and Lucas had felt the loss of it for a year, and then felt mainly the relief of the right thing having happened. "Why are you telling me this?" Colette asked. "Because you are the kind of person who should know the full picture," he said. "Not only the current frame." She thought about that for a while. Then she told him about a man she had known in San Antonio, a lawyer's associate named Raymond, who had courted her with tremendous correctness for 8 months, and then revealed that he had understood her as a project. A somewhat unconventional woman who, with sufficient attention and direction, would become a conventional wife. She had ended it in a conversation she still felt some satisfaction about in retrospect. "He did not see you," Lucas said. "No," she agreed. "He saw his idea of me." Lucas looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had now entirely given up pretending she did not notice. "I see you," he said. It was quiet and direct and had no flourish on it, and it hit her somewhere deep and central. "I know," she said. "That is simultaneously the most comfortable thing about you and the most alarming." "I will take that," he said. She was falling in love with him, and she knew it, and she was handling it in the way she handled things that frightened her, which was to keep working and to let the feeling exist without immediately acting on it, and to watch it carefully to see if it was real or if it was the loneliness of the past year and a half doing something false. It had the feeling of being real. It grew steadily and did not flare and die. It was in the quality of her attention when he was near, in the specific way she remembered the things he said, in the small and involuntary smile she had given up trying to suppress. What she could not quite determine was whether he felt the same, because Lucas Greer was a man of immense, sometimes maddening consistency. He showed up. He was attentive. He was warm in his particular, undemonstrative way. But he did not push, and he did not declare himself, and she could not always tell, with a man who was simply good and simply present, whether she was the object of something more or simply the beneficiary of that goodness extended equally to the world. She decided in May that she was going to find out. She did not find out, because May brought a crisis. A wire came from the county land office in the first week of May. A formal notice that her original deed was being challenged by a land speculation company out of San Antonio, a company that had purchased the outstanding debt her father had owed one of his creditors and was using that purchase to argue a prior claim on the property. The legal language was dense, and the implications were worse than the language, and she sat at her kitchen table with the notice for 2 hours before she was able to read it all the way through, without the words going slippery with the panic she would not allow herself to feel. She sent an urgent letter to a solicitor in Austin that she had corresponded with during the deed process. She pulled out every document she had related to the property. She made a list of facts, what she owned when she had bought it, what payments she had made, and she made another list of the legal arguments she could construct from those facts, working from what she knew of land law and what she had read in the county clerk's filings she had obtained last winter during the lease law debates. She did not tell Lucas. She told herself this was because it was her problem and her land and her fight. She told herself she was handling it. Both of these things were true. The third truth, which she was less comfortable with, was that the prospect of him knowing the fragility of her position, the chance that everything she had built might be pulled out from under her, felt like an exposure she was not ready for. She was still pretending, in some old and careful way, that she was entirely sufficient. He saw it within a week. He came by on a Thursday to return a wood plane she had lent him 2 weeks prior, and she was at the kitchen table with the deed papers spread across it, and she swept them together too quickly, and looked up with an expression she composed too consciously. And he stood in the doorway holding the wood plane and looked at her for a long moment. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing I cannot manage," she said. "Colette." It was just her name. He said it in a certain way with a patience that was not infinite but was very deep, and it did something, she told him, all of it. The speculation company, the debt claim, the legal notice, the precarious nature of her deed security. She told him in her most matter-of-fact voice, laying out the facts in order, and she watched his expression through the telling, which did not change into anything alarming. It was attentive and still and taking the information in without the reaction she had been dreading, which was the one that said, "Yes, I suspected this might happen. This is what happens when you try this kind of thing alone." "What has the solicitor in Austin said?" he asked when she finished. "He has requested 2 weeks to research the claim. He believes the speculation company's legal argument has significant weaknesses because the debt my father owed predated his purchase of the property and was not attached to the land in any recorded filing." "Then the claim is probably invalid," Lucas said. "Probably," she said. "Probably is not the same as certainly." "No," he agreed. "What do you need?" "I have it in hand," she said, reflexive. He set the wood plane on the table beside her papers and sat down across from her, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not the patient, unhurried look. It was something that had feeling in it, something that had been waiting to come forward. "I know you have it in hand," he said. "I know you are capable of fighting this and probably winning it, and I am not questioning any of that. I am asking what you need because you matter to me, and the things that matter to you matter to me, and I am tired of pretending I am here only as a neighbor." The room went very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was making its ambitious, crowded argument with the afternoon. "You never said that," she said softly. "You were not ready to hear it," he said. "I was trying to respect that. And now I am watching you sit alone with something frightening, and I am sitting on the other side of this table and I cannot do it anymore." He held her gaze. "So, what do you need?" She felt something break loose, not painfully, more like ice in a spring river, the slow and inevitable release of something that had been held too long against its nature. "Company," she said. "Honestly, just that. I have been alone with this for 8 days and it has been very quiet in here." He looked at her for a moment, and then he got up and went to the stove and put the coffee on. And she watched him move around her kitchen with an ease that should have startled her more than it did. And she felt the specific relief of a person who has finally said the true thing. He stayed for 3 hours. They talked about everything, and they talked about the land claim, and he helped her organize her strongest legal arguments into a clear written response to accompany her solicitor's work, because he had been through a land claim dispute himself and knew the county process. They drank all the coffee and then switched to water from the well, and at some point the conversation had gentled into something quieter. The mockingbird had gone and the evening had come, and she lit the oil lamp. "Thank you," she said in the lamplight. "You are allowed to need things," he said simply. "It does not make you your father. It does not make you anyone who leans on people without giving back. You have been giving this whole time. You just will not let anyone give you anything in return." She looked at the lamp flame. "I know," she said. "I am aware of what I do. I am not always able to stop doing it." "You are stopping right now," he said. She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was doing things to the room, softening its edges, and he was looking at her with everything he had been careful about now fully visible, the depth of his attention, the specific quality of his care, and something that she recognized from the inside of herself, looking back at her. "Lucas," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not wait for the question. She reached across the table and put her hand over his hand. He turned his palm up and closed his fingers around hers, and they sat like that, in the warm and quiet kitchen, while the evening settled around them, and she understood that this was not the beginning of something new. This was the arrival of something that had been traveling toward them for months, patient and certain, taking its time the way the truly important things always take their time. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, unhurried, and she felt it from her hand to the center of her chest. "I thought you were not going to push," she said. "I am not pushing," he said. "I am arriving. There is a difference," she laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, its fullness. She could not remember the last time she had laughed like that. Yes, she said. There is. The land claim was resolved in June. The solicitor in Austin, a sharp man named Morrison who had experience with exactly this kind of speculative legal maneuver, produced documentation that the debt her father had owed was not only unattached to the land deed, but had been partially discharged in a settlement before his death that the speculation company had failed to account for. The county land office dismissed the claim in full. The Tanner Ranch was Colette's, entirely and without encumbrance. She received the news on a Tuesday and rode to Lucas's ranch without stopping at the house first. He was on the porch when she rode in, and he read her face before she dismounted. "It is done," she said, swinging down from the saddle. He came off the porch in 2 steps, and she walked toward him, and then somehow she was in his arms, which she had not entirely planned. And his arms came around her with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed, just breathed, releasing 14 months and a land claim, and all the held-together silence of a woman who had not let herself be held in a very long time. He held her without saying anything, which was the right thing, and she felt his hand on her back, steady and warm. After a while she stepped back, not because she wanted to, but because she wanted to see his face. His expression was everything she had learned to read in him and something new in it, something open that she understood was a thing he rarely showed. "Good," he said, which was inadequate and exactly right. "Good," she agreed. He kissed her then, in the afternoon sun in the yard of his ranch, with his horses watching from the corral and somewhere the sound of the Culliver brothers working the south pasture. And it was a kiss with patience in it, and intention in it, and the feeling of something that had been decided, not in the moment but over months, by everything they were to each other. She kissed him back with the same intentionality, and felt something settle into place that she had not known was unsettled. They were slow and careful about the next part of things, because they were both people who had learned to be careful, and because what they were building mattered too much to rush. He came to her ranch, and she came to his, and they ate meals together and worked alongside each other with increasing ease and talked in the evenings on her porch or his, watching the Texas sky do its enormous, unhurried business. He told her he loved her in July, sitting on her porch in the heat of a West Texas summer evening, with the lightning bugs working the grass and the last of the sun gone to deep orange on the horizon. He said it in the way he said things, plainly, without rehearsal. "I love you, Colette. I have been working up to telling you for approximately 6 months. 4 months," she said. "I have been counting." He turned to look at her with that slight shift in his expression that was his version of amused. "Have you?" "I have," she said. She turned to face him fully. "I love you. I have known it since January, and I was frightened of it, and I handled that fear in my characteristic way. By being impressively self-sufficient in its vicinity," he said. "Exactly," she said. "It did not help. Most defenses do not," he said. He reached over and took her hand. "I am glad you are here. I am glad I did not sell the ranch," she said. He laughed, and she loved his laugh, the specific quality of it, rare and real. "So am I," he said. The summer passed in the particular richness of a thing that has been a long time coming and is now fully arrived. They were public about their courtship, which was the only honest way to be, and Calvert Creek had opinions about it in the way Calvert Creek had opinions about everything, which was loudly and briefly. And then they moved on to someone else's business. A few of the men who had watched her work the ranch alone with quiet certainty that she would fail adjusted their expressions when they saw her, and she did not give them the satisfaction of noticing. Earl, who had been watching the whole situation develop with the quiet perspicacity of a man who had seen most things, said when she told him, "About time." Then he went back to mending harness, and that was the entirety of his response, and she found it perfect. Lucas proposed in October. On the 1-year anniversary of the day, he had walked into her barn and fixed her pulley, and started something that neither of them had named at the time, but that had been named by everything that followed. He did it without kneeling because he was not a man for performance, sitting across from her at her kitchen table with a small ring that had belonged to his grandmother, silver and simple, with a small turquoise stone that was true to the land they were both on. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you need anything from me, and not because I need anything from you. Because we are better and larger together than we are separately, and I want to spend my life next to yours." She looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at him. She had been afraid of needing, and he had taught her, without argument or pressure, that receiving was not the same as depending. That love was not a debt structure. That two people could build something together and both bring real things to it and both be stronger for it. "Yes," she said. Completely and without reservation, yes. He put the ring on her finger, and she held her hand in the lamplight for a moment to look at it, the way women do with things that represent something much larger than the thing itself. "We should talk about the practical arrangements," she said. "Of course we should," he said, completely unsurprised. "I am not folding my ranch into yours," she said. "The Tanner deed stays separate." "Agreed," he said immediately, "and I will continue to manage it." "I would not expect otherwise," he said. "And I want it formally documented that the properties are separately held regardless of the marriage. Morrison in Austin can draw it up," he said, naming her solicitor. "I will write him next week." She looked at him. "You are very easy about this." "I am not marrying you so I can own your land," he said. "I am marrying you because you are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, and I am in love with you. The legal structure of the property arrangement is irrelevant to that." She reached across the table and took his face in both of her hands, the way she had wanted to for months without entirely allowing herself, and kissed him with every bit of what she felt, which was substantial. They married in November of 1883 in the Calvert Creek Church on a clear, cold Saturday with a sky that went on forever, as Texas skies tend to. Earl Hobbs stood on her side. Damon and Pete Culliver stood on Lucas's. The minister was a straightforward man named Abernathy, who performed the ceremony with appropriate brevity and genuine warmth. And when Lucas held her hands at the altar and looked at her with everything in his face that he usually kept so carefully quiet, she felt the full weight of the year behind her and the full promise of everything ahead. She said her vows without looking down. He said his without looking away from her. When they rode out of Calvert Creek together that evening, she on her own horse and he on his gray, her trunk roped to the back of the buckboard that held his things alongside hers, she looked back once at the road they had come from, the town receding in the early dark. She had arrived alone. She was leaving as part of something. They had agreed to use the Tanner house as the main residence for the first year while they planned what would come next, because it was better situated relative to both properties' primary range. Lucas sold the Greer house to Pete Culliver, who had been wanting to settle and had been saving toward it. And she felt something right about that, the way good arrangements create good outcomes that extend past the original parties. She was pregnant by February. She found out in the way that women found things out in that time, by the accumulation of evidence that her body was presenting, and the confirmation of a doctor. She rode into Calvert Creek to see on a February morning while Lucas was working the north fence, and believed she was going to town for supplies. She came home with supplies and news. He was on the porch when she came in, washing up before dinner, and he read her face in the way he always read her face, immediately and accurately, and he straightened and looked at her with a question in his eyes. "We are going to have a child," she said. He stood very still for a moment. She watched everything move through him, complex and quick, and then land in something she recognized as joy of the specific kind that has gravity in it. He came to her in 2 steps and took her hands. "Are you well?" he asked. "This first." "I am well," she said. "I am also alarmed and pleased and not sure in what proportion." "That sounds reasonable," he said. He looked at her hands in his. A child," she agreed. "We are going to need a larger house," he said. She laughed. She was doing that more now, laughing with the genuine fullness that had come back to her in the past year. "Yes," she said. "We will discuss the plans." They discussed the plans extensively. They planned with the mutual, practical pleasure of 2 people who loved each other and also loved a good plan. And in the fall of 1884 their son came into the world, healthy and enormous and furiously opinionated about it, and they named him Henry, for her father, which surprised Lucas and which she explained this way. He was not a bad man. He was a man who could not find the firm ground. I want Henry to know his grandfather's name so he can understand the difference between a difficulty and a failure. Lucas held his son in the first hour of his life with the same quietness he brought to things that mattered most to him. Sitting in the chair beside the bed where Colette was exhausted and bright-eyed and could not stop looking at the baby, and he looked at this small, emphatic person and felt something that had no word that adequately covered it. "Hello, Henry," he said. And Henry expressed a strong and wordless opinion about the entire situation. And Lucas looked at Colette, and she looked at him, and between them was something that would outlast all the difficulty and the seasons and the hard winters and the necessary fights. The thing that had been built out of a broken pulley and a shared fence line and 30 cups of coffee and the patient, reliable arrival of a man who saw her clearly and loved exactly what he saw. Henry grew loud and then louder and eventually verbal, with a comprehensive interest in every animal on both properties and the stubborn self-sufficiency that he had gotten, Lucas said, directly from his mother. Colette said he had gotten the stubbornness from his father, and the self-sufficiency was different from stubbornness, and she stood by that distinction. Earl's knees got no better. He retired to his sister's house in Calvert Creek in the spring of 1885, and Colette paid him his full month's wage through the end of the year, because she had the means, and because she thought he had earned it many times over. He came out to the ranch on Sundays sometimes, and sat on the porch and held Henry with the careful tenderness of an old man who was not going to admit to tenderness, and she let him. They hired 2 new hands, a young man named Thomas who was competent and quiet and dependable, and a woman, which was unusual enough in Calvert Creek that people had opinions about it until they saw the work. Her name was Vera, 24 years old, the daughter of a Mexican vaquero family from South Texas, and she could do more with horses than anyone else on either ranch. And she had the same quality that Colette had recognized in Lucas, the competence that had no need of announcing itself. Colette hired her and felt something close to kinship with her immediately. 1885 moved forward in the way of years that are full of things. The ranch had grown. The Tanner herd now ran at 63 head, and the Greer herd at 91. And they worked the ranges cooperatively in the way they had been building toward since that first shared fence line repair. Lucas had arranged an ongoing relationship with the Abilene market, and the price they consistently received for their cattle was significantly better than anything Calvert Creek would have offered. Colette expanded the house herself, in the sense that she managed the expansion, hiring a builder from town and contributing a very specific and detailed set of plans that the builder initially questioned. And then, having built 3 of the 4 rooms exactly as specified, conceded were structurally sound and well considered. Lucas contributed an opinion about the kitchen window placement and was entirely correct about it, and she told him so. "You are getting better at that," he said. "At what?" "Telling people when they are right," he said. "I always acknowledge when people are right," she said. He looked at her. "When they are clearly right," she amended. He was thoroughly amused by this, which she found satisfying in its own way. The second pregnancy announced itself in the early winter of 1886, with the same accumulation of evidence as the first, and she told him this time at dinner, across the table in the expanded kitchen, while Henry slept with great certainty in the next room. "Again," she said. He looked at her with the warmth he had gotten more expressive about over the past 2 years, the careful man learning the specific pleasure of being openly glad. "Again," he said. "I would like a daughter this time," she said. "I am not in charge of this, I understand that, but I am expressing a preference." "Noted," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand. "How are you feeling?" "Tired and strongly opinionated about specific foods," she said. "Otherwise well." "I will manage the North Pasture through April," he said. "So you can focus on the East Range." "I do not need," she began. "I know you do not need it," he said, with the patient firmness that she had come to recognize as one of the forms his love took. "I want to." She looked at him across the table. Outside, the Texas winter was making its intentions known against the windows, and the house was warm and lamplit, and full of the quiet that was not empty quiet but the full quiet of a life that had people in it. Her son slept in the next room. Her husband held her hand across the kitchen table. The ring on her finger had been there for 3 years and felt entirely like her own. "All right," she said. "That is the right answer," he said. Their daughter was born in July of 1887, in the heat of a West Texas summer that had opinions about its own significance. She was small and composed and regarded the world from the first with an expression of serious assessment that made Lucas laugh when he first saw it and made Colette say, "She has your eyes." He looked. The baby looked back, gray-green and considering. "She does," he said, surprised. "I noticed these things early on," Colette said. They named her Clara, which had been Lucas's grandmother's name, the grandmother whose ring Colette wore. Lucas held her in the lamplight the first night, and Colette watched him be undone by her in the quiet way he was undone by things, the steadiness of him absorbing something enormous. "She is very small," he said. "She will not be small for long," Colette said. "Henry started small." "Henry was never small," he said. "Henry arrived at full volume." "He got that from you," she said. "You have never once believed that," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it is a generous attribution." They were laughing together in the lamplight, quietly so as not to wake the baby, and Clara's eyes opened, and she regarded them both with the specific intensity that would turn out to be characteristic. And the small family of 4 that they now were occupied its own particular point in the universe. Nothing grand or documented or notable to the wider world, and entirely significant. Henry was 3.5 and was initially dismissive of his sister as an agricultural concern, but warmed to her within 2 weeks when it became apparent that she would watch him with unconditional attention. And she was thereafter his most devoted audience, and he was her most committed protector, which would turn out to be their shape for a very long time. The ranch continued. The seasons continued. The work was never finished in the way that work on land is never finished. It just changes form and character. She rode her fence lines alone still, sometimes in the mornings before the house came fully awake. She had always needed that. The particular quality of her own company in the early light, the land showing itself without any witness but her, the specific freedom of it. Lucas knew and never commented because he understood that this was not about being alone in the way she had once made herself alone, sealed off and armored. It was about loving the land directly, the way you love some things that don't require translation into words for anyone else. But when she came back in, coffee going, the sound of Henry debating something loudly with an opponent only he could see, and Lucas coming in from the barn with the morning still on him, and stopping to kiss her in the kitchen with the uncalculated ease of a man who was entirely comfortable being in love, she felt the full richness of the life she had built. Not instead of herself, not in surrender of anything, alongside herself and alongside him, and larger than either of them alone. She thought sometimes about the woman who had arrived in Calvert Creek on a freight wagon in September of 1882, with $17, and a grief she was determined not to show, and the absolute iron conviction that she was going to make this work, and was going to do it alone. She was not entirely different from that woman. The determination had not gone anywhere. The competence had only grown. But the aloneness had changed its nature, from armor to simply a quality she could choose sometimes, because she was no longer frightened that accepting anything from anyone was the edge of a cliff. That had been Lucas, not what he had given her specifically. The pulley, the fence line, the Abilene market, the legal support, the 30 cups of coffee, the 3 years of marriage and 2 children and counting. But what he had demonstrated by showing up with that same unhurried certainty every single time was that being seen did not mean being diminished. That someone knowing the places where you struggled did not give them power over you. That the right person seeing through your careful armor was not a threat but a relief, the specific relief of not having to hold everything quite so tightly anymore. She had fought hard against being seen. He had seen her anyway, calmly and persistently, and with enormous respect for the fight she was putting up even while he was gently, absolutely declining to be kept at the distance she was trying to maintain. In the autumn of 1888, with Henry now a determined 4-year-old and Clara a vigorous 1-year-old with her father's eyes and her mother's absolutely uncompromising will, Lucas and Colette sat on the porch of the Tanner house on a September evening exactly 6 years after she had arrived in Calvert Creek on a freight wagon, and the Texas sky was doing its enormous, profound business, stars beginning to appear in the dark blue east while the west was still gold. 6 years, she said. Nearly 7, he said. He was holding Clara, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder with the total commitment of a small person who had decided the situation was satisfactory. Henry was inside being talked to firmly by Thomas about not feeding the horses the kitchen bread, a conversation that was audible through the window. "I thought about selling," she said. "When I arrived, I thought about it for about 48 hours. What changed your mind?" "I walked the North Ridge and looked south," she said, "and I understood that I was not leaving." "I am glad you were not leaving," he said. She looked at him in the evening light, at the familiar planes of his face and the line of his shoulders and her daughter asleep against him. And she felt the specific gratitude of someone who has built something real, something that required everything she had to build and was worth every bit of it. "You saw through me every time," she said. "From the very first morning. You were not as hidden as you thought," he said. "I was very hidden," she said. "I had years of practice." "You were hidden the way a lit lamp is hidden by a blanket," he said. "You could feel the warmth right through it." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very good thing to say." "I have 6 years of practice," he said. She reached over and took his free hand, and they sat in the growing dark with their daughter sleeping between them and their son's voice carrying through the window and the land spreading out in every direction. Her land and his land, worked and known and tended, and the evening coming down over it all in the way evenings do over things that have settled into what they are meant to be. She was not the woman who had arrived alone anymore. She was herself, unchanged in the essential ways, competent and determined and capable of going a very long time without asking for anything. But she had learned, in the specific school of a man who had watched her from the first with clear and steady regard, that receiving was not weakness, that being known was not vulnerability, and that love, the real kind, the kind that showed up without performance and stayed without condition, was not something you needed to protect yourself from. She pressed his hand in hers. He pressed back. The stars were coming out fully now over Calvert Creek, over the Tanner Ranch and the Greer Range and the cedar-lined creek between them that the survey called a boundary, but that had always been, in practice, the seam where their two lives had stitched into one. Henry came out onto the porch with an expression that indicated the conversation with Thomas had been resolved in Henry's favor, which she would address in the morning. "Mama," he said, "are there more biscuits?" "In the tin on the shelf," she said. "One?" "Two," he said. "One," she said. He looked at his father. "One," Lucas said. Henry went back inside, calculating something. They heard him negotiate with Thomas about the precise nature of one biscuit's maximum size. Thomas, who had the patience of a man who had met Henry before, engaged with this seriously. Lucas and Colette sat in the dark, their daughter sleeping, the stars overhead, the ranch around them in its autumn quiet, and they were entirely where they belonged, and they knew it, and that knowing was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing, the one they had both been working toward from different directions and different distances, for longer than either of them had understood at the time. She had arrived alone, and she had made something of it, entirely and without apology. And then she had let someone in. And the something she had made had become something larger, something with more weather in it and more warmth, something that would outlast both of them in the form of Henry and Clara. And whatever came next, growing up on this land that she had refused to sell on a ridge in 1882 because something deep and stubborn and right in her had said no. "This is yours, stay." She stayed. He came, and everything that followed was real,